For 7 seasons, Daenerys Targaryen was the heart of Game of Thrones. She was the impossible dream made real, a young woman with nothing but a name and 3 dragon eggs, who built an army, crossed an ocean, and repeatedly chose mercy over massacre. She freed the slaves of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. She knelt before the living to fight the dead. She said, more than once and in more than one way, that she did not want to be Queen of the Ashes. Then came Season 8, Episode 5, The Bells. Daenerys hears the surrender bells of King's Landing, looks at the Red Keep, and chooses to burn the city anyway, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. This one scene didn't just end her story, it destroyed her legacy. It made every sacrifice she had ever made feel hollow, every speech she had ever given feel like a lie, and every fan who had invested in her journey feel cheated. The Mad Queen turn is now one of the most controversial moments in television history, not because Daenerys turned villain, but because the show failed to earn it. This is the story of how one scene undid 8 years of character building, why it happened, and what it reveals about the fundamental mistakes of Game of Thrones' final season. The setup, what the scene should have been. Season 8, Episode 5, The Bells. To understand why the bells broke so many people, you have to understand what it was supposed to be. This episode was the culmination of Daenerys' entire arc. 8 years. 73 episodes. Countless battles, losses, hard choices, and moments of grace, all pointed at this moment. The city of King's Landing, seat of the Iron Throne, was finally within reach. Cersei Lannister, the woman who had schemed and murdered her way to the top, was cornered inside the Red Keep. Daenerys had dragons. She had the Unsullied. She had the Northerners. She had won. And then the bells rang. The city surrendered. The war was over. By every rule the show had ever established, by every principle of warfare, honor, and mercy that Daenerys herself had invoked over 7 seasons, this was the moment to stop, to land, to walk through the gates of a surrendered city as its queen. This was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, the camera holds on her face, her jaw tightens, her eyes go cold. And then Drogon banks hard toward the city streets, not toward the Red Keep where Cersei hides, not toward the soldiers who are already laying down their swords, but toward the crowded streets full of men, women, and children who have nothing to do with any of this. The systematic firebombing begins. Block by block, street by street, Daenerys burns the city she came to rule. It is visually stunning. The prior fights will shut down America, and the empowerment is missing. The horror on the faces of Tyrion, Arya, and Jon Snow watching the carnage is genuinely affecting. As spectacle, it works. As character, it is a catastrophic failure. 7 years of who she was. To appreciate the magnitude of what the show threw away, you need to remember who Daenerys was for 7 seasons. In Season 1, she was a frightened girl sold into marriage by a brother who viewed her as a commodity. She survived. She adapted. She found agency in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. In Season 2 and 3, she was a commander without an army learning what leadership actually costs. She made difficult decisions, but always within a moral framework. When the slavers of Astapor offered her an army of Unsullied in exchange for a dragon, she took the army, and then freed the slaves and burned the slavers. She could have just taken what she wanted. She chose to punish the guilty and spare the innocent. In Season 4 and 5, she governed Meereen and repeatedly restrained herself from the kind of fire and blood retribution her advisors sometimes counseled. When the sons of the Harpy were murdering her Unsullied in the streets, she was urged to respond with overwhelming force. She chose negotiation, compromise, and patience instead, even when it cost her politically. In Season 6, when she finally unleashed fire against the Khals who had imprisoned her, it was targeted, specific, and, by the show's own moral logic, entirely justified. She burned men who had enslaved and threatened to gang rape her. She burned people who deserved it, and then she walked out of the fire and led their people to freedom. In Season 7, she crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons and an army. She had the power to burn King's Landing to the ground on day 1. She chose not to. She said explicitly, that she did not want to be Queen of the Ashes. She repeatedly overruled advisors who told her to strike decisively with her dragons because she was concerned about civilian casualties. This was who she was. Consistently, across 7 seasons, a person who had the power to destroy and repeatedly chose not to. That's not a character who hears surrender bells and burns civilians. Not without a transformation that the audience can follow, understand, and accept. The missing bridge, what the show needed to show us. The problem with the Mad Queen arc isn't that Daenerys turned. Characters turning is good storytelling. Walter White turned. Tony Soprano turned. Michael Corleone turned. Great fiction is full of protagonists who become villains, and those stories are often the most powerful ones ever told. The problem is that Game of Thrones tried to cover a journey of multiple seasons in a handful of episodes, and the result was not transformation, it was teleportation. A credible villain origin story requires 3 things: cumulative pressure, internal logic, and the audience's ability to track the shift even as they mourn it. Breaking Bad took 5 seasons to turn Walter White from a high school chemistry teacher into a drug kingpin. At every step, the audience could see exactly how he got there, could even understand, if not endorse, the logic of each choice he made. Game of Thrones gave Daenerys' turn roughly 4 episodes. And those 4 episodes were already crowded with the aftermath of the Battle of Winterfell, the political fallout of Jon's parentage, and Cersei's endgame maneuvering. The Mad Queen arc was competing for screen time with a dozen other plotlines, and it lost. What was shown? The show gave us Missandei's execution, Rhaegal's death, the loss of Jorah Mormont at Winterfell, Jon's growing popularity, and Daenerys' increasing isolation from her advisors. These are real losses and real pressures. They matter. What was not shown, what was missing, was any sustained interior look at how those losses were rewiring Daenerys' moral calculus. We needed scenes of her alone, struggling with the darkness. We needed her to voice, even privately, a willingness to cross lines she had previously held sacred. We needed her to take small steps toward cruelty before we could accept the giant leap of burning a surrendered city. Instead, the show gave us a grieving queen who was perhaps too isolated, perhaps too angry, and then jumped directly to mass murder. The connective tissue was never written, the bridge was never built. The bells themselves, why that specific moment is so damning. Of all the choices Daenerys makes in the bells, the specific decision to continue burning after the surrender bells ring is the most indefensible and the most revealing of the show's storytelling failure. Because Daenerys knew what the bells meant, the episode itself establishes that she knew. Tyrion tells her, explicitly, that if the city surrenders and the bells ring, she must stop. This is not ambiguous. This is not a cultural misunderstanding. This is a clear, stated condition that she agreed to in principle. When the bells ring and she burns anyway, the show wants us to read this as a descent into madness driven by grief and isolation. But the camera doesn't show us madness. It shows us a clear-eyed, deliberate decision. Daenerys doesn't look confused, or dissociated, or lost in a fugue state. She looks like someone who has made a choice and is following through on it. That's a problem, because if she's in control of her faculties, then this isn't madness, it's premeditation. It's a woman deciding to commit mass murder against civilians who have done nothing to her, whose city has surrendered, whose soldiers are throwing down their swords. That's not the Mad Queen. That's a war criminal. And war criminals don't emerge in a single episode from 7 seasons of deliberate restraint. They are built slowly, through a gradual erosion of moral boundaries, through small compromises that accumulate into large ones, through a process the audience can witness and understand, even as they recoil from it. Game of Thrones skipped that process entirely, the retroactive poisoning of 7 seasons. What makes the bells uniquely damaging, more than just a bad episode or a rushed arc, is what it does to everything that came before it. When a character turn is earned, it enriches the preceding story. You go back and watch earlier episodes and see the seeds that were planted, the moments of foreshadowing, the hairline cracks that eventually became fractures. Walter White's transformation makes his earlier scenes more interesting in retrospect. The tragedy is richer because you know where it's going. When a character turn is not earned, it does the opposite. It empties the preceding story of meaning. Every moment of grace becomes a lie. Every act of mercy becomes a facade. Every time Daenerys chose the harder, kinder path, every slave she freed, every massacre she prevented, every time she pulled back from the edge, now reads as either naive foolishness or deliberate deception. Fans who had watched every episode, who had cried when Drogo died, and cheered when the Unsullied were freed, and held their breath through every battle, those fans suddenly found that the character they had loved for 8 years had never really existed. She was a narrative tool, not a person. She was always going to be the final villain. Everything else was set up for a punchline. That is a brutal thing to do to an audience. And it explains why the backlash was so visceral, so sustained, and so personal. People weren't just disappointed by a plot decision. They felt that years of emotional investment had been invalidated. The hints were there, but hints are not transformation. Defenders of the Mad Queen arc point to foreshadowing that existed throughout the series, and they are not wrong. The hints were there. Her father, the Mad King Aerys, was famous for wanting to burn King's Landing to the ground. The capacity for that kind of destructive rage is, potentially, heritable. The show established this early and returned to it occasionally. Daenerys did burn people alive on multiple occasions. The Tarly execution in Season 7, where she executed Randyell and Dickon Tarly by dragonfire after they refused to bend a knee, was presented as a troubling moment. It divided her council. It alarmed Tyrion. It was the show's most direct suggestion that her methods could become her undoing. There were moments throughout the series where her anger flared dangerously, where advisors had to talk her down from decisions that would have cost innocent lives. These moments existed. But here is the critical distinction. Hints at a capacity for darkness are not the same as a demonstrated pattern of escalating cruelty. Foreshadowing is not character development. Showing someone capable of going to a dark place is not the same as showing them actually going there, step by documented step. The show confused the two. It planted seeds in seasons 1 through 7, then jumped directly to the harvest in season 8 without doing the farming in between. The gap between capable of darkness and actively chooses mass murder of surrendered civilians is enormous. The show needed to close that gap. It never did. What a proper arc would have looked like. This is worth being specific about, because critics of the finale are sometimes accused of simply wanting a happy ending for Daenerys. That misses the point entirely. A dark turn for Daenerys could have been extraordinary television. It would have required time. Season 8 should have been at least 10 episodes, if not a full season of 13. The Long Night and the War for the Dawn deserved their own resolution arc. Daenerys' political deterioration in King's Landing deserved its own arc. The psychological portrait of a conqueror who arrives with good intentions and gradually discovers that ruling is nothing like liberating, that she cannot make people love her, that the small folk she has idealized her whole life are indifferent to her, that the throne she fought for feels hollow when she finally sits in it. That story needed room to breathe. We needed to see her make smaller, cruel decisions first. An execution here, a city burned as an example there. We needed to see her advisors leave her one by one, not out of loyalty to Jon, but out of genuine moral horror at what she was becoming. We needed to see her relationship with her own ideology curdle, to watch her convince herself that breaking the wheel required breaking everything first. We needed, in short, to grieve for her slowly. The way we grieved for Jaime Lannister every time he took a step backward. The way we grieved for Theon Greyjoy through his entire arc. Game of Thrones knew how to do this. It had done it before. It just didn't do it here. The lasting damage to the show's legacy. Game of Thrones was, for several years, the most watched, most discussed, most acclaimed television drama in the world. Its first 4 seasons are considered among the finest in the history of the medium. Even its middle seasons, when the adaptation pressures began to show, were defended by a loyal audience that believed in the show's fundamental commitment to complex, consequence-driven storytelling. That commitment is what the Mad Queen arc violated. The show had built its reputation on the promise that no character was safe, that plots would not be resolved tidily, and that moral complexity would always be honored. Daenerys' arc in Season 8 violated all three. She went from protagonist to villain not because the story demanded it, but because the ending did. The journey was sacrificed for the destination. The consequence is that Game of Thrones now exists in a strange cultural limbo. People recommend the early seasons enthusiastically and then add the caveat, just stop at Season 4, or watch through Season 6 and then decide. The ending has become a footnote that colors everything that came before it. Not all endings do that. A bad final season of a great show can often be set aside as an unfortunate addendum, not a fundamental indictment. Game of Thrones' finale can't be set aside so easily, because it involves the main character. You can't just stop watching before Daenerys burns King's Landing and still feel like you've watched the whole story. You watch Daenerys for 8 years. The ending is her ending, and her ending retroactively reframes everything.